Hello, everyone. Welcome to Be a Better Leader podcast. This is season 5. This season, we're exploring how the 4 disciplines of execution are helping organizations across the globe execute on their top priorities. My name is Scott Thele. I'm the national practice leader for our business outcomes practice in the US and Canada. I'm being joined by Anne-Louise McLean, who's the practice leader in Australia. Good morning, actually, Anne-Louise. So wonderful of you to join us.
Thanks for inviting me. Thanks, Scott.
And Harvey is a practice leader here in the United States. Harvey, thank you so much for coming on with us today.
My pleasure. Good afternoon.
Hey, our topic today is the urgency trap. So we're looking at how strategic focus versus being reactive to things as they come into us can consume our time, energy, and keep us from executing. So we'll jump in and I'll ask each of you the question. Harvey, let me start with you. Firstly, for those of our guests who are not familiar, would you mind quickly explaining the whirlwind? What is the whirlwind and how is it at play?
Sure. You know, what I love about the term that we've chosen to use, the whirlwind, is I hear it pronounced so many different ways. But I think of it often as a force. I found myself describing it this way. It's the thing that grabs you in the parking lot, brings you into the building, and spins you about throughout the day. And when the day is done, it leaves you back in the parking lot, and you ask yourself, what did I actually do today? That's really what I think the whirlwind is.
Wow, that's great, and we've all felt that, so I can certainly relate. I'd like to ask Anne-Louise, so when you think about the whirlwind, what makes it the biggest barrier for most leaders?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely. Actually, it's probably the biggest topic of everything we talk about at the moment as far as a barrier to achieve execution. That day to day, people are feeling like, their intent is they want to pay attention to things that are important for the business, development of their people, execution of their priorities, but they find themselves, just like Harvey mentioned, that, you get sucked in from the parking lot and all of a sudden it's your back-to-back meetings, you're trying to recruit, you've got staff shortages, everything is pressing upon you that it's just so people are feeling like there's just no space to breathe, to get attention to those most important things.
We've certainly all seen that for leaders. We start the day with great intentions and then we find ourselves, as Harvey said, back in that parking lot. So let me ask this question, Harvey, of you first. Do you see this issue with the leaders themselves or more the teams they lead?
My answer to this question is always the consultant answer. First of all, it's both. And it starts like everything else. It starts with leadership. And the challenge for leadership is confronting the reality that the whirlwind is real. Because it's so important, right? It's all this important stuff, the metrics, the things that you really care about. It's real. But in confronting the reality that it's real, you have to also confront the fact that its existence can knock you off your goals. And then for the teams, individual contributors and others in the organization, the challenge is the whirlwind is a bit of a thing to hide behind. The reason I can't do this is, and then you've heard, Scott, in your career, every answer for why that can't happen, right? So it's the leaders confronting the reality that it is there and it is impeding their progress. And it's making sure that the teams are not using the whirlwind as the excuse for not executing.
Great. Thanks so much, Harvey. Anne-Louise, what do you think about people saying, the whirlwind is undesirable or we don't want to get stuck or do the whirlwind? Oftentimes, people approach us and ask, is the whirlwind a good thing or a bad thing? How do you handle that question?
Yeah, good question. So, and actually, first of all, it's when you start to talk about the terminology of the whirlwind, people really, or the language of the whirlwind, people just have this realization of, yes, that's exactly what it's like. But then thinking about it, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a reality of day to day. I think the watch out, though, that I hear a lot of people talking about is creating a bit of an urgency culture that everything ends up being, I had one organization recently said, everything is either urgent or a high priority. And so they get caught up in just this urgency culture and that they feel overwhelmed by thinking that, well, this is the whirlwind. But it's actually when we clarify and we really look at what really sits in the whirlwind, those day-to-day things that we need to do to move the organisation forward versus what's really important, where we want to apply the lens of 4 disciplines. I think that's when people start to realise, okay, the whirlwind is not necessarily a bad thing. It's part of the day-to-day. The watch out is probably how we create an urgency culture sometimes. And how do we step out of that to give attention to those things that are most important?
You know, Anne-Louise, as you were saying that, it just strikes me that regardless of where you are in the world, this same story plays out. And you're in a whole different part of the planet than we are. Is there any difference in how the whirlwind is perceived? I hate to be cliche, but down under?
I don't think so at all. You know, I was working with leaders just yesterday, and this was the number one topic that we were grappling with. And you know, when I think about it, I think about their story. So, for example, you've got a leader that just a couple of weeks ago, they had this great strategic planning session. They're getting ready for 2023. And they've got people together that they probably haven't seen in even a couple of years. There's a lot of energy. They've got this strategy. They've now gone back to their desk, and all of a sudden they're overwhelmed by just the day-to-day. They've got back-to-back meetings. They're short-staffed at the moment. We've got a lot of people down under experiencing difficulties in staff shortages or rapid growth. And so they're just getting consumed by the day-to-day. And I find this breath of fresh air when people realize, there's a process, there's something that we can do to help create this space that we can still attend to those things that we really need to pay attention to ensure that we do execute on our strategy. Or that 2-day meeting that we just had a couple of weeks ago, it's just going to be for nothing.
Yeah, so true. And it is, I think, everywhere that we go, we see the same thing. So Harvey, you mentioned, I loved what you said, people sometimes hide behind the whirlwind as an excuse. So how do you respond to somebody who says the whirlwind is 100% and I simply have no time for anything at all?
I love getting that comment, because here's my response, and I use it all the time. I say, totally agree with you. It is 100%. So let's just agree now that here we are at the end of the year and you had a strategic imperative that you had to achieve. When you talk to your boss, and you say to them, I spent 100% of my time in the whirlwind, does that give you a pass? If the answer to that is yes, then you're good. But if the answer is quite conceivably no, you're going to have to figure out how will you find that piece of time that will allow you to move the goals forward. So it's just really a simple choice, right? And your ability to use that as a way to not deliver the results.
Very good, Harvey. I really appreciate that. And Anne-Louise, I actually think that bears another look. So how do you respond when people use that whirlwind as an excuse, saying it's 100% of my time, I'm just too busy?
Yeah, actually, this is quite a common response. And this is where I find it useful then to really step back and really look at, particularly where we're sort of saying, well, is everything really urgent? Let's actually, and, it can feel a little bit energizing, a little bit addictive when we feel like, everything is urgent or an absolute high priority, and really just start to tease out what are the choices that we're making, and are we really clear about what our priorities are, and are we making time for that? And are we taking ownership and accountability for that? But at the same time, not wanting to trivialize, if people are feeling quite overwhelmed by workload or a sense of urgency around things. But I find people really appreciate being able to sort of step back and really question what is truly our most important things and how do we create space for that.
That's fantastic. And the last thing you said, Anne-Louise, was create space. One of the things that we talk about is the ratio of the whirlwind to the 4 disciplines, like with the wildly important goals that we're putting time towards. How do you explain that ratio of time, and have you seen it help? So I'll ask Harvey first, sorry. Have you seen it help kind of depressurize when you give people permission to acknowledge that the whirlwind is going to take a significant portion of their time?
I think it does. And part of the way you help people with that, it goes back to a negotiating technique that I learned from Chris Voss, who was the FBI negotiator, and he said, sometimes you have to ask the question, well, have you given up on achieving your results? I mean, because when you ask that question, it sort of reframes the mind, doesn't it? A little bit, well, no, I haven't. Well, then, if you haven't given up on that, how will we find the space to get it done? So it sort of brings people to a place of, you're right, and I haven't given up on it, so how do I find the space to do it?
That's great. Thanks. And I loved you bringing that other example in. Anne-Louise, so let's start with you. Have you struggled with balancing the whirlwind? And if so, I feel like that's a trick question. Of course you have. But what works for you? Like, how do you get out ahead of the whirlwind and that urgency trap that we see people falling into?
Yeah. And to be honest, it's a daily challenge, particularly when there's a lot on your plate. For me, I really connect well with Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And he actually says within that book that if there is one thing to really improve and positively impact your effectiveness, it's the practice of weekly planning. And just like we do within 4 disciplines and applying that in the way I think about my time, it's thinking about at the beginning of every week, what is it that is most important and how do I force that into my calendar first? And actually even the process of every day sort of reflecting, have I got the balance right? Am I actually attending to the most important things day to day in a way that I can sustain effectiveness over the longer term? Because if I find as soon as I don't do that, if I don't have that discipline, that I just get caught up. I'll just be, the calendar will be full and I will feel like I'm constantly reactive to the day-to-day things that are coming in.
Yeah, I think the fact that the whirlwind can and will fill whatever container you pour it in if you don't exert your will upon it. So, Harvey, what about you? Any particular techniques that you would share with our listeners to help them deal with this urgency that surrounds us at all times?
Sure. I'll sort of give a refinement to what Anne-Louise said, also as a practitioner of 7 Habits thinking. But I go a little closer in. A weekly plan is my map for the week. You ever follow a map and find you're on the wrong street? So my daily interaction is, but where am I now? Right? I mean, I know today's Thursday. So as we record this, it's Thursday afternoon. Where am I now? And where was I hoping to be by Friday? And I course correct a little bit in the daily space, because while we live thinking about the week, we act in the day. So I start the day with that sort of course correction. Where am I now, and how's that going to impact where I really want to be by tomorrow?
Wow, that's really helpful, and I can't believe how fast time goes by when I'm talking with 2 people that I enjoy as much as you both. So and to wrap this up, first of all, Anne-Louise, thank you for joining us, and for you, it's Friday morning, so if you want to find out, Harvey, how Friday goes, you can call Anne-Louise.
Right.
Harvey, thank you for joining. It's always been a pleasure. Just for our listeners, as we listen to Harvey and Anne-Louise, a couple of things that I would encourage you to think about. First of all, the whirlwind is based on urgency, but it's not a bad thing. So acknowledging that people are inherently busy gives you permission to start talking about important priorities. And I think you have to acknowledge that it's always going to take at least 80% of your time, energy, and effort. So give it permission to do that. And then finally, I think both of you have said something to the tune that you have to carve out the time. Anne-Louise, you talked about the 7-day cycle, and Harvey, you talked about even a refinement on a daily basis. I hope that gives you all something that you can take away, and we enjoyed having you today and look forward to having you on our next Be a Better Leader podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.